You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
As close as I can estimate, there are about 1,000 federal employees, civil and military, by, let's say, January 1, 1790. And George Washington was convinced that that number was insufficient to the needs of the country because the number of personnel grew throughout his administration. Didn't double, but it probably grew by around 30 to 40% before he left office in 1797. The principal areas of growth, there's a substantive growth in the Army. There's a big percentage growth in the number of postmasters. That number sort of doubles every 8 years or so throughout the early American Republic. And there was a steady growth in the number of civil personnel.
Hello, and welcome to episode 420 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. When we think about the founding of the United States, we often focus on the Constitution, the Founding Fathers, and those first landmark elections. But how did the United States actually go about building its federal government? That entire apparatus of state that could collect revenue, manage international diplomacy, provide law and order, and extend its reach across a rapidly expanding nation. Who are the people who made that government work? And how did their service to the nation shape what it meant to be an American citizen? Peter Castor, a professor of history and American cultural studies at Washington University in St. Louis, and the founder of the Creating a Federal Government 1789 to 1829 digital project, joins us to explore this remarkable and often overlooked story of how the United States built its federal government between 1789 and 1829, and then how that government grew from an idea into a functioning, sprawling institution with tens of thousands of employees. Now, during our exploration of the early federal government, Peter reveals how the federal government was built from the ground up after 1789, including surprising continuities with the pre-Constitution era form of government, what the day-to-day work of federal employees looked like, and how their service impacted the United States' expansion and state building, and how digital tools can help us uncover the lives of the more than 30,000 men and women who helped build the federal government, and how you can use those tools to explore their stories today. But first, I have a quick update to share. You might be listening to this episode on our dedicated Ben Franklin's World iOS or Android app. Unfortunately, these apps will be retired at the end of October 2025. My podcast hosting service created and managed these apps for us, but they've decided to discontinue this support, which means the apps will sunset at the end of October. The good news is Ben Franklin's World is available on all the major podcast apps, and I've even put together a helpful list of all the major apps that you can check out. Visit benfranklinsworld.com/listen. That's benfranklinsworld.com/listen, and you'll find that list. And if you need any help finding a new app or setting that new app up, just email me, liz@benfranklinsworld.com, because I'm really happy to help, and I know your listening experience will be improved. All right, are you ready to explore the origins and construction of the United States' federal government? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian. Joining us is a professor of history and American cultural studies and the Associate Vice Dean of Research at Washington University in St. Louis. He's a scholar of the early American Republic, and he also studies the American presidency from its origins in the 18th century through the present day. He's written or edited 8 books, including William Clark's World, Describing America in an Age of Unknowns. And he joins us today to discuss his new research project, a digital project, called Creating a Federal Government, 1789 to 1829. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Peter Castor.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Peter, your digital project, Creating a Federal Government, 1789 to 1829, seeks to explore, quote, the remarkable story of how the Founding Fathers built the institutions of the United States government and of the men and women who served in government during the crucial decades that followed the ratification of the Constitution, end quote. And I pulled this language directly from your project's website. So I wonder if you would tell us how you came up with the idea for this project and why you decided to create a digital project instead of doing what most scholars do, which is turn all their research on a subject into a book.
This project, like many digital projects, it has its own origin story. I came to this as somebody who'd been working in digital history for a long time. And I'd like to say that I'd always wanted to do a digital project like this, but it actually has a different story. I was going to write a book. It was going to be a top-down story about how the founding fathers created the institutions of government. And one of the first things I wanted to do was to better understand those institutions. How many people served in them? How long did they serve? Where was it? And not only was there very little information on that, but what information I read, it didn't read right. So I knew that before I could write the story, I had to count the numbers. How many people served in the federal government? Where were they? And to me, that just screamed digital project. And the more I worked on it, the more fun it was, the more exciting it was. So that then took center stage. And so that's how the digital project actually ended up preceding the book I'm writing on this subject.
And how does your research for creating a federal government, how does that fit within your broader scholarship? Because I took a look at your other work, and it's mostly focused on the Louisiana Purchase, the Corps of Discovery, and work that seems to have been mainly about the West and the expansion of the United States. So how does the bureaucratic structure of creating a federal government fit within your scholarship?
At first glance, it doesn't look like they're connected, but they're actually inextricably linked. So my first book, which is about the Louisiana Purchase, and this is a story I tell because it's a reminder that our research projects emerge in unplanned ways. I was working at the papers of James Madison. I was in graduate school, and I was reading and transcribing correspondence from the winter of 1803, 1804. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were writing to each other saying, "Send me the information on Louisiana." And the response from the other was, "I thought you had the information on Louisiana." And then they were writing about what the government was going to be. And building that government was central to how I was going to write the story of how the U.S. extended west of the Mississippi River. So that was the first thing that got me interested in this. And then when I was writing about William Clark, he was, of course, somebody we know from the Lewis and Clark expedition, but he was the territorial governor of St. Louis for over half a decade. He spent almost his entire adult life as a federal employee. So that story was really, really interesting to me. So it's actually not a big leap from that early work on the West in the early Republic to writing the whole story of the federal government. So unlike some folks who will kind of start at the centers of government and then move west, I actually started at the West and then moved to the center. I moved from the periphery to the center, and that really informs how I understand it. That these federal appointees, no matter where they are, often saw themselves as being on the peripheries because they're not in the national capital, but they're the center of the story.
Well, let's take a look at the center of this story before we dive into your project, Creating a Federal Government. Would you tell us about the origins of the United States federal government? Where should we look for those origins? Where do they start? Is it with the drafting of the Constitution of 1787, or are we looking at a different date?
So I want to look earlier than the Constitution, and I don't even really want to look at the Constitution because everybody learns about that in civics class. There's an executive, legislative, and judicial branch. What the Constitution did not talk about much were federal agencies and who would serve in them. There is a brief reference to the fact that agency heads have to undergo advice and consent, but there's no real clarity about who supervised the federal workforce. So the Constitution was a bit vague on that. And what I want to emphasize is that many of the first people who worked for the federal government were already public employees before 1787. There was, of course, the United States Army, the single largest employer in 1789. People often hear about how George Washington resigned at the end of the Revolutionary War, and they assume that the army was dispersed in its entirety, but it wasn't. There was an army, and Henry Knox was in charge of it. There was a diplomatic corps, and there were a variety of people who ran that. So there were publicly employed officials who reported to the Continental Congress before 1787. And the way those offices were laid out really established the framework for what the federal workforce would become. The biggest change occurred for revenue officials. The individual states collected revenue. They had public employees who were responsible for doing that. The largest single sources of public revenue were property taxes and import duties. And by 1789, by the moment George Washington came into office, those revenue officials assumed that they were going to work for this new federal government. Why do we know that? Because they besieged Washington with requests to keep their jobs. My favorite example of that is a guy named Thomas Melville, who was a veteran of the Revolutionary War. He had been a revenue official in Massachusetts, and he wrote to Washington in June 1789. He did just write to him. Other people came to New York trying to meet with Washington personally. And Melville wrote, I served in the war. I've done a good job. I have a lot of children I have to sustain. So please keep me in office. I'll be a good employee. Keep me in office. He wrote this in the more formal language of the 18th century, but informally, that's the message he was sending. And Washington kept him in office. And Melville stayed for what seemed like forever. He was a revenue official until 1829. He was in his early 80s when Andrew Jackson fired him or forced him into retirement, however you want to call it. And clearly he told his family members that this was a steady gig. This was a good day job. He probably told that to his grandson, Herman Melville. And when Herman Melville was going to write the great American novel, he was working in the Customs House in New York. And I tell that story because Melville's move from a state official in Massachusetts to a federal official in 1789 speaks volumes to how there was a national government before 1787. And that is the government that the authors of the Constitution assumed this new political apparatus would take charge of.
Well, since you mentioned Melville, Herman Melville's father married General Peter Gansevoort's daughter in Albany. So the hero of Fort Stanwix was Herman Melville's maternal grandfather.
I forgot that. That is a terrific story. I'd completely forgotten about that and his connection to that Dutch landed and political aristocracy in New York.
Yeah, and Herman ended up spending a lot of time at his Gansevort grandparents' house because it turns out his father was horrible with finances, so he often needed the Gansevorts to help support his children, including Herman.
That would actually make Melville typical of many federal employees during this time. There are about 18,000 letters of application and recommendation during the period I studied. And many of these letters are from people who kind of mix and match why they think they should be employed. They first and foremost say, I am loyal to the Constitution. They don't say I'm loyal to you personally. They say I'm loyal to the Constitution and to little r republicanism, to what the nation stood for. But then they often say at some point or another, through no fault of my own, I've fallen on hard times and I have a large family to support. So I'm the perfect candidate for public employment.
I like how in your telling of the creation of the federal government, we're talking about people and the important roles that people played in the government, because the government was also created by we the people. Now, I am curious about what we mean by federalism. What makes the government created by the United States Constitution a federal government?
Asking an early Americanist what we mean by federal government is sometimes like asking someone what their favorite color is. You get a lot of different answers. But the way I always explain it to students who often come in assuming that the federal government refers exclusively to the national government headquartered in Washington, I say I start with federalism, which is about a set of relationships between the states and a central government, and then between the institutions of that central government. For purposes of my project, the way I use the federal government is to talk principally about the agencies of the central government that was headquartered first in New York, then Philadelphia, then Washington, D.C. I'm less concerned with Congress. I do include the judiciary in this. They're part of it. But my principal concern is with the federal workforce. And it's about a set of relationships and a system of authority whereby you have public employees who report to superiors, who in turn report to the president of the United States. So for me, the federal government is this apparatus that's created by the Constitution, headquartered in the national government, and which employed over the period I studied, I found over 38,000 people who were federal employees during this period. And so that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the federal government.
And what was the apparatus that the Constitution established? So what is the structure of the federal government, and how do the federal employees that you study fit into this structure?
I find when I teach undergraduates, what's striking to me is many of them still see that old 1970s television series Schoolhouse Rock. Many of them have seen Three Ring Circus, which is the cooked down telling of the federal apparatus, where you have three branches, three seemingly co-equal branches: the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary, each with different designated duties. It's not just that they are equal, that they're all important, but it's also that they have highly specific duties and responsibilities they're supposed to fulfill. And to make it more specific, the legislative is Congress, which is divided into two houses. The executive is only specified in the person of the president and the vice president, who would succeed the president upon the president's death. And then the judiciary, which in the Constitution refers really only to the Supreme Court. And one of the most interesting parts of working on this project was revisiting the process during 1789 and 1790, when Congress in its legislative role passed bills that the president in the executive role signed that kind of breathed life into these institutions, so that very quickly, within a year, the executive was more than simply the president and the vice president. It included these federal employees who reported to the president. And during the first term of Congress, there was a conversation about who was going to have responsibility for federal employees. Would it be Congress? Would it be the executive? Would it be some joint group? And they very quickly concluded that these people needed to report to the president. The other thing was, through the Judiciary Act of 1789, there suddenly was much more than just a Supreme Court. There were district courts and circuit courts, so that by the end of 1789, federalism was a much more elaborate system. There were still three branches, but there were more people in them and more obligations that each one of them had.
So it sounds like the early legislative branch didn't really have that many federal employees that the House and Senate needed to oversee, but the early executive branch did have a fair number of employees that it had to manage, at least in these early stages of government.
No, Congress directly did not. I mean, there were, and still are, congressional employees. There's a sergeant of arms. There's a clerk of the House, clerk of the Senate. There's a chaplain. You see the chaplain showing up very quickly. But Congress had an absolutely essential oversight role in this. And it emerges in three principal words in the Constitution: advice and consent. It's a phrase many people learn now. It's actually the subject of a novel that was made into a movie about a confirmation crisis that's set in the 1960s. And the Constitution stated that the Senate would serve in this role of advice and consent, not just for treaties, not just for nominations to the Supreme Court, but also for agency heads. And one thing that George Washington did was he took that very, very seriously. And he assumed that this was more than just a simple legal requirement, but it embodied a system of oversight. It would be a restraint on executive overreach. It would guarantee a role for Congress in supervising the federal government. So he started submitting just about every employee's name to the Senate for advice and consent. And this went from second lieutenants in the United States Army up to Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, all of those familiar names. And he just was doing this over and over and over. And it shows up in the Senate records all the time. And it's a very important part of this story. The example I think of, which is, I was working in the National Archives and I'd seen a listing. It said Thomas Jefferson, nominations. I ordered these and they brought me an ammo box. So this wasn't some acid-free cardboard box with all of these folders in it, what archival researchers are used to. I mean, this was literally an ammo box, probably held, 50 caliber ammunition or something like, and you open it and there's sheet after sheet in Thomas Jefferson's hand in which he will say, I nominate so-and-so to be Secretary of War. I nominate so-and-so to be the revenue collector in Charleston. It's just sort of whatever job was vacant at the time. And I tell this story because it was a really important part of how I worked on this project. But also, here we are over a decade after Washington established this precedent, and his successors assumed that it was their obligation to put all of these names for advice and consent to maintain a proper balance between legislative oversight and then executive authority over the federal workforce.
You've raised a couple of ideas that I think we should explore in more detail. First, let's talk about this idea of checks and balances. I think in a lot of our minds, we have this idea that the United States has three branches of government that are co-equal with each other. So what are the systems of checks and balances that are woven into the Constitution that allows each of these branches to check the power of another branch of government?
Well, in theory, the Constitution treats them as such. And what I would emphasize is it treats them also as distinct, that they're each separate from each other. They each have certain powers that the other does not. So that distinctiveness is important. Congress has the power of the purse. It develops the budget. The executive would supervise diplomatic relationships, military relationships, Native American policy, which was absolutely essential during this period. And the federal judiciary would have responsibility over issues of law and justice. And those were very clear, but then there were certain ways in which they clearly would be checks. It's an example of a really important continuity because often as historians, we often say, here's how we see things differently. Well, I want to start by saying, here's something that we see that's really the same, that's been unchanged in the way we study and talk about this, which is that Congress had powers over the executive had a distinct role, the judiciary had its own role, and this was all born out of a fear at the time that if any one institution of government had too much power, it could become either corrupt or tyrannical in some way. You really see that written into the Constitution. And one of the striking things to me is that judicial review, which is one of the aspects of the legislative role that is now such a part of how our government operates, is kind of the last piece of this puzzle. It really takes the case of Marbury versus Madison to make that truly clear. But how this relates to the federal workforce, Marbury versus Madison is a federal workforce case. And it's also all about checks and balances. So in the final days of the Adams administration, Adams nominated a slew of people. He knew he'd lost the election. He wanted to populate offices with them. And this included a number of justices of the peace in Washington, D.C., which had just been constituted. So he nominated several people. He could not hire them. He nominated them. He submitted them to the Senate for advice and consent. This is an example of kind of co-equal but distinct branches. And the Senate approved them. Adams just never went about the task of sending them their commissions. Commissions had been written, they hadn't been sent. And James Madison stumbled on these commissions. And Thomas Jefferson, the newly installed president, wrote something like, I consider these a nullity, meaning these don't count. And then Marbury, who was one of these justices of the peace, sued in federal court to claim that he was owed this office because it had been through this process. And the Supreme Court in this case says the court has a power and a duty to evaluate decisions of the federal government. So this speaks to my larger point. The Constitution did establish these basic principles about distinct offices, each of which could check the other in some way. But what that would mean in real terms didn't assume real form until the early sessions of Congress. The other point I would emphasize is that when we talk about the three branches of the national government, we can't lose sight of the fact that federalism is also about the relationship between the central government and the states. That one of the other remarkable aspects of the Constitution is the way it divvied out power. It divvied it out to the executive, to Congress, the judiciary in ways that would prevent any one of them from acquiring too much power. That was the design. In ways that gave each one of them a job that, enabled its members to feel like they mattered. And it did the same for states. It gave certain roles to the states, certain roles to the central government. And the story we often know about that is that these different areas of government were always at odds. Like, we know this is going to come up in the run up to the Civil War. We see it now.
Wow. I don't think I've ever thought of Marbury versus Madison as being a legislative check on the executive branch, but you're right. It totally illustrates the point of checks and balances woven into the Constitution. I knew about the case. I just never thought of it that way. So thank you for that new perspective. It still leaves us with the question, however, of whether all three branches of the United States government, the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, are equally powerful with each other. These three branches work together and they oversee each other with checks and balances, as we've just talked about. But did the founders set up one branch of these government institutions to be more powerful than any of the others?
All three branches have different powers. During the era of the founding fathers, the judiciary was far and away the weakest of the three. We tend to focus on the Supreme Court. I think it's essential to focus on the lower courts, particularly the federal district courts, whose jurisdiction was very limited. They had almost no criminal jurisdiction. Their jurisdiction was limited primarily to maritime cases, interstate conflicts, and a small number of other areas. And that's really, really important. There are very few cases that wind up with them. Those federal courts actually also had certain administrative duties in the ports of the United States. So they're the weakest of the three. In 1789, Congress was the most powerful because it had this control over the budget. Congress had the most people. But I would argue that by 1793, 1794, the executive was tremendously powerful and in some ways more powerful than Congress because it had a workforce. The numbers, I know, are something we'll want to talk about, but it was growing very quickly. The people serving in that, their numbers far exceeded the number of people in Congress. Congress allocates the budget, but the executive spends it. And the people who gather the money that fuel that budget are executive officials. And that makes the executive tremendously powerful. And the other part of federalism that often gets out of this is the areas that were not states. You asked me, how did I get from the West to the East? Well, I never lose sight of the West. In 1790, and certainly by 1795, almost half the territory claimed by the United States did not consist of states. You have a Northwest Territory, Southwest Territory, and eventually a Mississippi Territory. And that's all governed by the executive branch through the territorial system, which gives the executive branch absolutely extraordinary powers, extraordinary governing powers, extraordinary decision-making powers at the most vulnerable and often the most important points in the Union. So while we often have a story that emphasizes congressional power, because the executive at that time was not nearly so large or far-reaching as the executive branch is now, the executive branch was really powerful. And as I study the early republic, I see pretty broad-based policymaking powers for the executive.
Those are really interesting points. And like you said, we often hear about congressional supremacy during the early years of the Constitution. But when we do take your perspective and we do look at the government from the West, it certainly does look like the executive branch had a lot of power. Now, I think we should talk about the growth of the U.S. government from this 30,000-foot view of it. When we talk about the size of the federal government in this early period, what exactly are we talking about? What do we mean by the size of the federal government?
That was one of the initial questions that drove me, because people talk about that a lot, and they do it to fuel current arguments. Because they talk about the founders. They say the founders wanted a big government. They say the founders wanted a small government. My starting point is we have no clue what kind of government they actually built, and that's really the question. And then the other question is, did they consider the government they had sufficient to the challenges that they faced? So 1789 is the starting year, but it's a difficult year to measure because there's all this flux as people are getting appointed. What I would say is that by 1790, there were probably around 1,000 federal employees. And I say probably around because measuring those numbers is really, really difficult. The administration learned that the hard way in 1792, because in 1792, Congress came to the executive and really demanded an enumeration. How many people have you hired? And Washington delegated that to his agency heads. He didn't want to deal with it. He delegated it to his agency heads. And they spent weeks trying to answer this because the nature of record keeping at that time did not record this. And in fact, the report from the Postmaster General, this is one of the largest agencies, all it had was the Postmaster General because they had not kept track of how many people they had. So as close as I can estimate, there are about 1,000 federal employees, civil and military, by, let's say, January 1, 1790. And George Washington was convinced that that number was insufficient to the needs of the country because the number of personnel grew throughout his administration. Didn't double, but it probably grew by around 30 to 40% before he left office in 1797. The principal areas of growth, there's a substantive growth in the Army. There's a big percentage growth in the number of postmasters. That number sort of doubles every 8 years or so throughout the early American Republic. And there was a steady growth in the number of civil personnel. The striking area that really wasn't growing was in the central offices. These were geographically dispersed. They're decentralized. And that's one of the reasons why the running of this was incredibly inefficient. When you have a president sending the nominations to the Senate, that's a terrible use of the president's time. But it's because the central offices operated pretty inefficiently during this time. So that's the number of people that you get. Even though the United States had started building ships for its Navy, the Navy didn't go to sea until 1798. So you don't even have those people entering the numbers until the Adams administration. And then the last number I want to throw at you is a non-number, which is the territorial offices. Because every territorial official reported to a territorial governor, who reported to the Secretary of State, who reported to the president. I see them as federal personnel, but many of them, you get a couple dozen people in any federal territory in the civil branches of government, plus most of the U.S. Army was there. But then what do you do with all the militia officers who actually serve an important role at key moments? They're unpaid. It's not a full-time gig. There are hundreds of these guys. I don't include them in my 1,000 people in 1790, but I consider them part of the federal workforce because in a moment of crisis, the president could inform the Secretary of State to send an order to the territorial governor to bring out his forces, which would include a territorial militia. Or the governor himself might choose to do so to mobilize the militia during a crisis.
So by 1790, our best informed estimation is that the U.S. government employed around 1,000 people, plus everyone involved with territorial governance. Peter, what happened to the size of the young federal government from the end of George Washington's 2 presidential terms, so 1797, until the end of your project in 1829? Did the government grow? Did it shrink? We know that Thomas Jefferson wasn't exactly keen on the idea of big government, and he was in office for 2 terms. So what happened to the size of the government?
Jefferson always thought government was big, unless he thought it was insufficient to what the United States needed. I'll give you an example of that. So there's actually a little of both. There was a certain steady state that emerged in the early 19th century, but there are periods of significant change. I want to start with the continuities. By the end of the Jefferson administration, you get what is a number of government employees in peacetime that's probably around 30,000 people. But again, civil and military. I really, really want to emphasize that because the largest number of employees were enlisted personnel in the military. The second largest number were postmasters. So I keep running into that kind of 30,000 number. The data that I've accumulated, this project doesn't have those military personnel. I'm planning to add them, but we don't have their numbers played out individually. It's most stable during much of the Madison, Monroe, and John Quincy Adams administrations. It's much more volatile during the other ones. It's not just that the numbers are smaller. Obviously, it has to go from about 1,000 to almost 30,000. But there are moments when the numbers change. So you kind of have to look at it agency by agency. There's a steady growth in the number of federal employees during the Washington and Adams administration. Thomas Jefferson came into office stating that he was going to reduce the size and scale of the federal government. He said that in 1801. In 1802, he did fire a number of civil employees, but in almost every case, he did not eliminate their office. Rather, he eventually decided to hire other people for those offices because he concluded those offices were necessary. A lot of them were federal revenue offices that were essential to the budget. The other thing that Jefferson did to reduce the number of federal employees was to reduce the United States Army. But he was coming into office right at the end of the Quasi-War. So demobilization was happening anyway. So he reduces the number of Army employees, but then 6 months later increases the number of Navy employees when the U.S. engages in this undeclared war with Tripoli. Tripoli declared war on the U.S. The U.S. didn't declare war on Tripoli. So that's what I mean. It's really volatile. So by 1802 and 1803, Jefferson had reduced the size of the Army, increased the number of employees in the Navy, seemed bent upon reducing the number of civil officials, but then the Louisiana Purchase mandated hiring all these civil officials for a vastly expanded territorial government, which would then be absolutely crucial for his presidency and his successors. I mean, it becomes the most important domestic policy challenge of the early 19th century, which was governing the territory acquired through the Louisiana Purchase. And then that would have an effect on preserving the United States Army because Jefferson ends up moving most of the Army into the Trans-Mississippi West, and he and his cabinet concluded they couldn't really reduce it because there were very serious threats that they saw from Spain, from Native societies, and from enslaved African Americans. And so that's what I mean when I say it's really volatile. It changes from year to year. But when I graphed it, see, they didn't have Excel in 1800. When you graph it with a trend line, that trend line goes up at a pretty steep angle. And then it balances, it spikes again during the War of 1812. It goes down in 1815, but it eventually reaches this steady state of about 30,000 individuals.
Peter, before we dive into your digital project, Creating a Federal Government, why did you choose to study the government's growth and development between 1789 and 1829?
So the start year for this, I wanted this to be about the federal system created by the Constitution. Constitution's written in 1787, ratified in 1788, but then the government promulgated by it didn't come into being until 1789. And crucially, that's the moment when you've got a president who has employees who work for him. So that start year was important. I ended in 1829 for several reasons. The first is the familiar political one. To anyone who's taught U.S. history, you kind of have this moment around 1829. We talk about the shift from the first party system to the second party system. You talk about the move from the founding generation to Jackson and all the people clustered around him who came of age in a different time. All of that's totally true. The other thing, though, that really mattered to me was I was doing a project that was about a government that came into being to meet a specific and discrete set of policymaking objectives. And many of the objectives of the federal government were shifting in the 1830s. So that was another reason to end it then. That both of those things overlap. Changes in politics, changes in policy. You also have changes in culture. And also, some of the sources I was using dried up then. So it made sense. In my dream world, I would have the great story of federal employees up through the Civil War, but I'll have shuffled off this mortal coil long before I would have finished that project.
Okay, we should dive into your digital project, Creating a Federal Government. But first, let's just take a moment of breather and thank our episode sponsors. Ben Franklin's World exists because of listeners like you, people who believe that history matters. We're an independent podcast produced by Clio Digital Media, the nonprofit that Karen Wolf, Joe Edelman, and I founded to support this show. Now, we don't have any corporate sponsors or university backing. Instead, we have something much better, a community of history lovers who make our work possible. Every donation, whether it's $5, $25, or $100, helps us bring you in-depth conversations with leading historians. Your support helps us uncover forgotten stories, explore the ideas that shaped early America, and keep this podcast free and accessible for everyone. And your donation is fully tax deductible. So here's the math. If every listener gave just $5, we'd meet our annual production costs. Now, to everyone who's already given, thank you. And that includes Emily Y., Nathan D., Rose D., Philip R., and Bruce W. Your support truly makes a difference to our work, and it helps keep this podcast going. Thank you for your donation. Okay, are you ready to help? Visit benfranklinsworld.com/donate. That's benfranklinsworld.com/donate. History is a conversation. Thank you so much for your help in keeping it going. Peter, let's dive into your digital project, Creating a Federal Government. When we visit the Creating a Federal Government website, what will we find, and how should we attempt to navigate this website?
Thank you for asking me that. And this is something I thought about a lot when I was working on this, and I was very lucky to have a group of digital humanists, designers, and coders who are helping me figure out how to make this work. And I have this principally divided into 4 major areas. The most important one to me is what I call the archive. And this is where you can see the individual career profiles of about 38,000 federal employees. That's the story I wanted to tell. I wanted it to be their individual stories. You go in there, you can search for an individual. You can say, I want to find my ancestor. You type the person's name in. Or you can say, I want to see every U.S. Marshal, or I want to see every State Department employee. That's how the archive works. My model for it actually was IMDb, the Internet Movie Database that people have been using for almost 30 years, where you can look at a movie and then see everyone who was in that movie and then see every movie that every one of those people was in. You can find an individual, look at that person's career, and then look at everyone who had that same job. That's the first part, the who. The next part is the where. I wanted people to be able to see where federal employees were. So that meant building a map. And it meant using different technologies for this. The archive works on a Drupal platform. The map was developed using Leaflet, which is a mapping technology that's used for all kinds of purposes. And there I wanted people to be able to literally see where the federal government was. For example, to see that by the 1820s, it's global. It's not just in almost 2,000 locations in the United States. It's in Honolulu, Hawaii, and Manila in the Philippines, and in North Africa, and in Western Europe, and Latin America. It's all over. But then to connect the map to the archive. So you look at a place, you say, I want to see everyone who worked here. It'll show you everyone who worked there. So that's the story of these people. But then, as I said, I wanted this to tell a story. So we've got the who, we've got the where. Then I wanted it to be kind of the why, to tell an interpretive story about how the federal government came into being, what its role was, how it was organized, how it changed over time. And that's almost less driven by the sort of data story. And that's more about me, someone who has spent really the last 30 years studying these questions of federal governance. And so I wanted to tell a story that would be accessible to anyone. That was the really important part to me. I wanted this to be something that my scholarly colleagues would look at and they'd say, well, I didn't know these details, and here's a research resource for me. But I also wanted it to be something that a high school civics class could use. When they want to know, what was federalism? I've got a section in there where I say, what do I mean when I talk about the federal government? What was that? And then I want it to be something that a genealogist uses so that they can find their ancestors. The final part is kind of the how. How did I build this thing? That's got the bibliography for this, but that was a very important part for me because I wanted other folks working in digital humanities to get a sense of what's involved in building a project like this, but also any researcher working on it to know the source landscape. I didn't want that to be limited just to other academic historians. I wanted anybody who looked at this, anybody who was interested in it, to be able to find out how they can get to the materials that I was using.
Well, let's visit your archive for a moment. Say we are working on our genealogy research and we're trying to find out more about an ancestor who was an early federal employee. Where will we find the information about them or anyone else who was working for the early federal government?
If you select anybody in the archive, you will see what I call their federal employment record. What are the offices that they held and when did they hold them? And when I say, what is the office that the person held, it will have the person's job title. It will have part of the government that they served in, where they served, and when they served. For some of these people, we also have biographical information. For the vast majority of them, we don't, because I haven't found that information yet. But for cabinet officers, for federal judges, for certain high-profile individuals, they're all in there. William Clark, who I wrote a book about, I got his birth and death date and what state he was born in. John Quincy Adams, likewise. The offices are really, really interesting because these offices were described in different ways at different times. So what I have is what I call a generic office that standardizes the office title. But after you get this basic story, here are the jobs they held, where they were, and when they were. Below that, it lists every source that I got this from. That's not just me sourcing my information, but it's a roadmap for any other researcher. And then it says, here are the individual titles to the offices. The goal was to keep this very streamlined so that someone could quickly grasp anybody's career.
And where did you find all of these federal employees? You mentioned that early government records are not so great. So where did you find information about the approximately 30,000 people who worked for the early federal government?
There's several 100,000 records that I used for this. And then you kind of cook them down because they're repeated in different sources. So I'll begin with the fact that in 1792 and in 1802, and then beginning in 1816, and then every 2 years afterwards, the executive produced a list of all their employees because Congress mandated it. So what do you do for 1789 to 1792 and then 1792 to 1802? It meant being a historian, using a bunch of resources. The first one that I started with was the Senate Executive Journal, because that is a treasure trove on this, because presidents so cautiously assumed that they needed to submit everyone for advice and consent. There are over 5,000 records of nominations submitted during just this 40-year period, and every one of those is a story. Sometimes it's someone appointed to a job for the first time. Sometimes it's somebody being renominated for a job that has a finite time period. Often it's someone filling a vacancy, and that record will say, I nominate so-and-so to be the collector of the revenue in St. Louis in place of so-and-so who expired or resigned. And so you also get some information about why people left office. So I started with that. That required manual transcription by a terrific group of research assistants because it is so inconsistently appearing in the Senate record that no automated system seemed to be able to capture that. I mentioned there these published registers, got those manually transcribed because, again, a computer couldn't do it. The biggest piece of manual labor was for the postmasters. In the 1960s, a group of archivists in the National Archives did a preliminary inventory of these record books that recorded every time someone was appointed to the post office as a postmaster. They're amazing because this older technology, they would take a piece of loose leaf paper, feed it into a typewriter, type the first record, and then when the next guy in that locality showed up several pages later, they'd handwrite it. They wouldn't feed it back in. This is all pre-computer. So I had a terrific research assistant who wanted to explore a career in history and lived in the DC area. And I hired her to spend a summer photographing all of these. And I think there were about 15,000 postmasters and 12,000 post offices. She did it all summer. Once she photographed that, I used research assistants to transcribe all of that. My point is this, like many digital humanities projects, this rests on the work of a tremendously talented group of research assistants. But I don't want to say there weren't records that were already digital. The State Department Historical Office had a terrific data set on U.S. diplomats and chiefs of mission. They just provide that because it's in the public domain. The Federal Judicial Center has an extraordinary database of federal judges, and they just handed this stuff over to me. Every federal agency has a historical office that has done extraordinary work generating it. And at this moment, when many of those offices are at risk of being shut down, I can't help but say I could not have done this project without the work that all of them do. Then there were private groups. There is a U.S. Lighthouse Historical Society. And the guy who built their website, which includes a list of lighthouse keepers going up into the early 20th century, just handed me the data. He said, all I ask is that you cite me. So he gave me a list of all these lighthouse locations and their lighthouse keepers who worked there. So it was really a matter of drawing on all of these sources and bringing them together. Then at the end, I had to look at every one of these people. So you gather all this data, you get a computer to guess. It says, all right, there are 5 records of someone named John Smith, who's the revenue collector in Charleston, South Carolina. I think it's the same guy. I needed to look at that. That went pretty straightforward. But what do you do with the 30 references to someone named William Clark? And I had to eyeball that and make some decisions. Well, I tried having a computer do it, and the computer got it wrong. It thought the William Clark of Lewis and Clark, who the system knew had lived in Kentucky, was the same William Clark who was a U.S. attorney in Kentucky. I knew it wasn't. And also I used sources to check that. So it didn't even quite know that this wasn't the same William Clark who was a consul in Emden, Germany, or the William Clark who was a clerk in the War Department. I thought it was the same William Clark because the William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame had been in the Army. So it meant reviewing every one of those individuals. Why this project took a really long time.
I know digital projects are never really done, but does creating a federal government have all of the records that you wanted to include in it? Have you uploaded and verified all the different records you and your assistants collected?
It's done for now. And I think if I added nothing else to this and it just stayed as it is, I'd be delighted and I'd be ready to move on to something else. I see this as phase 1 in at least a 3-phase process, but phase 1 is the most important. The next part of this is going to be to add those letters of application and recommendation. And there are thousands of these. I've done the preliminary indexing on all of those. I had a tremendous group of undergraduates and graduate research assistants who took this collection from the National Archives, a lot of which has already been organized by the Founding Fathers projects because they wrote to the founders. And so the editors there did this. But then connecting those images of these guys' letters to the people who later held office. So that's phase 2. That's very important. Phase 2 will also include everyone who later served in Congress. Phase 3, which would be ongoing and would involve kind of regular additions, would be biographical information as I acquire that, and also people who served in state office. That's actually pretty difficult to find. There are terrific biographical data sets on members of Congress, U.S. Congress. There aren't for members of state legislatures. And then the final piece of this is to make all the data downloadable. So that's something that A New Nation Votes did and did it really well, which is to make all their data available. I'm not quite there yet, but if someone goes on it now, the most important part of this is there. The federal government in a way no one's ever seen before, the first true enumeration of the early federal government, and the stories of all these men and women who served as federal employees.
When I clicked through your archive of records, I found women. And I was really surprised by this because we are talking about the early federal government, and employment between 1789 and 1829 would have really meant jobs for men. How many records did you find for women, and what kinds of jobs were women performing in the early government?
So let's begin with the fact that one of the things I often say about this project is there's no HR department in 1800, by which I mean it isn't just that the federal government was not terribly well organized, it means there are no central personnel files. That's kind of what I was doing. I was reconstructing. I was kind of creating an HR department. But one of the first things that goes into anyone's record is certain basic information about them. When they're born, how they identify by gender, in some cases, how they identify by race and ethnicity. You don't have that here. So first name had to be the stand-in for this. And my data does not presume to know what the gender of the person is. That's partly because we don't know how people identified then, but also because there are plenty of names that men and women used then that might be used differently now. Terry, for example, names like that. So what I ended up doing was using a data set of 18th century first names that's been developed with the most likely gender definition for that and sort of stacked it up that way. And just on a preliminary run, there are at least 60 women in this, and there are probably more. So what are the kind of jobs they have? Well, on the front page of this, I thought 38,000 people. How the heck do you tell that story? So I said, I'm going to pick 4 people and tell their stories to understand what federal officials did. Folks at the highest rung and at the lowest rung. So I had John Quincy Adams, who spent much of his life as a federal employee and later became a president. I used William Clark, who I'd studied a lot, who also spent a long time, and he speaks to the federal government in the West. I used Thomas Melville, and then I used a woman named Elizabeth Kelly, who was a nurse in a U.S. port in the 1820s. So there are a small number of nurses. That women would be nurses in the early 1800s probably wouldn't surprise people, wouldn't surprise your listeners, because women constitute the majority of nurses now. What might surprise them is that the U.S. actually maintained maritime hospitals. These hospitals were a really important part of the way the federal government understood international trade, because the majority of federal revenue came on import duties. And if the U.S. did not have a robust maritime economy, its whole economy would suffer. So they said the government needs to maintain these hospitals. So the nurses there are very important, but they're very few in number. The largest number of women who served in the federal government were probably in charge of post offices. The title is postmaster. There's no title of postmistress, but that would be the title I used for them. And that really speaks to how these post offices operate. The number of post offices keeps growing during this period, doubles probably every 8 years. And the vast majority of post offices were in country stores and places like that. When I was trying to map out where they were located, it was very, very difficult because you have a locality that doesn't exist anymore. Or the locality is Jones's store or Smith's Ferry. So there are women serving as postmasters. I suspect in many cases, they're not appointed to that. Their husbands were, their husbands died, and they took over the job. But one of the first women I encountered was a lighthouse keeper. And in 1789, there's a correspondence within the Washington administration. Do we keep her in the lighthouse? And Washington says, absolutely. And it isn't because he thought she was doing such a great job, but he saw it as a deferred pension. Her husband had served in the Revolution, had died in the Revolutionary War, and this was in the absence of a formal pension, the way the government was supporting her. That's how he understood it. But what's really, really striking to me is that we'll start with the fact that there are so few women. It's not just a male-dominated government, it's a male-populated government. But nonetheless, founders seemed quite at ease with the notion that women would be paid employees of the federal government.
And what about people of color? You mentioned that the federal government did not have a centralized HR or employment office in this early period. So were there also opportunities for people of color to work as paid employees of the federal government as well? I'm thinking we have federal standards, right? But everything happens differently on the ground.
So there are critical moments when large numbers of people of color were essential to governance. So this project is about how did the federal government operate? What did it do? How did it do it? Probably the largest number of people of color who served the federal government were African Americans who served in militia units in Louisiana and then would periodically be armed during wartime. One of the things we know now is that throughout the extended colonial and immediate post-colonial era of North America. It was commonplace during wars that the recently enslaved would be armed and would serve in the empires and then in the United States in which they served. What I will say is that those people are not in this database because we don't have records of them as such. It's partly because militias were these units that the federal government didn't really treat as their own, even though in territories they were part of it, but also because the federal government isn't going to record people of color. It isn't going to legitimate what they do. Does that mean they were not there? No, they were there. I'll give you one example. One of the people who shows up in here is Toussaint Charbonneau. And to the Lewis and Clark fans out there, they know that name. Toussaint Charbonneau was a translator who was hired by the Lewis and Clark expedition. He shows up. He brings with him one of his wives, Sakakawea. She enters the story. It's all this Lewis and Clark-y story that we know. Well, Toussaint Charbonneau was a Métis, and he was majority Native American. He was of mixed Indigenous and French ancestry. And so in the culture of the US-Canadian borderlands, he's part of a distinct ethnic group. In the United States, he would not be treated as white and would not enjoy full citizenship. He's in this nebulous status. But he goes on this expedition. The expedition ends, but he shows up again in the 1820s as an interpreter in the Northern Plains. There's no racial classification in these registers. So that's crucial. So it doesn't say he is of mixed race ancestry. I just happen to know that he was. My guess is there are other people there. And some of the amazing work of historians is to show how people of mixed race ancestry would at times choose to insinuate themselves into white society because it's the only way they're going to find opportunity. How could that not apply to the federal government? There must have been people of mixed race ancestry who were federal employees, but the very fact that they were able to get that employment rested on them being able to obscure or hide the fact that they were of mixed race ancestry. So that's in some ways not a satisfying answer to your question, but it's what I've come to conclude about this. The final point I will add is that the largest number of people who are known to be of mixed race ancestry emerged in the late 1820s and really problematically in the early 1830s. And they're in the Indian service. Because at the very moment of removal, Andrew Jackson and his War Department, they went on a hiring spree because they knew that removal would require a workforce infrastructure. And so they start hiring these people. And a number of them are interpreters, and they're clearly of mixed race ancestry.
Peter, you mentioned that the Creating a Federal Government website is one that we can use and play around with. When we visit your project, what is the one thing you hope that we will walk away with after we've played around with your project's different features? What do you hope we'll better understand about the early federal government and its work?
My starting point for this is actually a big question about what is the American government, what is its purpose, and what do the founders want? What I always say to people is that if you just look at this website to see the size and scale of the government, you will see that the founding fathers believed in and created a federal government that was larger and more capacious and more flexible and more dynamic than many conservatives now would believe. But it was also a government that was smaller and more limited than many liberals would want. So part of my point is partisans need to approach this early period with caution. You're not going to get entirely what you want, and you need to acknowledge that is in some ways exactly what you don't want. I will say that after reading all of this stuff over the years about how people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison wanted to have a government that was as small as possible, I realized that was mostly based on a few comments from the late 1780s and then the sort of late 1790s. And if you look at these guys, they're actually pretty robust state builders. The founding fathers believed in a robust federal government, and their ability to translate ideas into action was entirely dependent on the institutions of government that they had built. So that's the first part of the story I want people to know. Second part is I want them to see that there was a federal government, that it extended to all corners of the United States, and that it was there then and it moved in this dynamic way. That's a big picture story. I also want them to see what it meant to be American for tens of thousands of people that emerged from federal employment. Americans voted. That's partly how they understood what it meant to be American. Or they said, I'm not allowed to vote. And that's how they knew what it meant to be American. There are people who served in elected office, and that's how they knew what it meant to be American. But tens of thousands of people for whom the federal system became real by being federal employees. I also really believe strongly that as people study their roots, I want them to find their ancestors here. Your ancestor doesn't have to be a Supreme Court justice. Your ancestor can be a postmaster in a little town because that person's story helps you understand what it meant to be American during this critical period.
Now, before we move into the time warp, I posted a link to your project in the Ben Franklin's World listener community on Facebook, which is free to join. And Shari played around with creating a federal government project and noticed that there are places on your project team for non-historians. So Shari asks, assuming this work is voluntary, how many volunteers do you need to help with this work? And how can people who are interested reach out to you so that they can contribute to adding more records to your project?
A few other people have contacted me. Gosh, if I had 20 people working with me, that'd be a phenomenal start. And I really, really want to emphasize this. So as I said, I want to build this out in several ways. First of all, I want to have people who will help me do a second run of cleanup to see if there are any problems in it. Soon after I finished it, I went in there and I immediately noticed an error. I was able to fix that, but that's because I stumbled on it. I want people to check some of those areas where we've got lots of records for people with the same name, but we're not sure if they're the same person. So I would want them to do some research on that. I really want people who can help me research the biographical information, because there are terrific biographical resources that we can use just to find out where people were from when they were born and when they died. But that's a pretty labor-intensive process. Those alone are the first areas of it. For people who are really into this stuff, continuing to work with those letters of application and recommendation. They're phenomenal records. When Americans wrote to say, here's why you should hire me, they are always giving vent to their day-to-day lives in 1790 or 1800 or 1810 and what they understood republicanism to be. They're just amazing, amazing letters. They're usually dreadful job application letters. But these people writing these letters, it takes them forever to get to what they're asking for. But as sources on everyday life, they're amazing.
Now it's time for the time warp. This is the segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. Now, in the Why It Matters section of the Creating a Federal Government Project's website, the project team notes that, quote, the founding fathers were far more comfortable with increasing the scale and the capacity of the federal government than many people now believe. But they also did so with the uncertainty and with limits on the range of government services, end quote. Peter, in your opinion, what if the founding fathers had been more cautious or focused on limiting the size of the new nation's national government? What would the development of the United States have looked like between 1789 and 1829?
It would have taken a turn for the worse. So let's begin with the fact that the first aggressive area of hiring was in the Treasury Department. One of the stories we know now is about the fiscal miracle of the 1790s, where Alexander Hamilton creates this plan and it helps bring the United States out of economic chaos into a period of far greater stability. All of that depended on the capacity of the United States to levy import duties on ships plying the Atlantic trade. That would have been impossible without the aggressive recruitment and ongoing employment of revenue collectors. The other part of the story that would have been profoundly different and really has two different ways of understanding it is that, of course, the United States, as we literally see it today, would have taken form much later and possibly far less successfully. I spent a lot of my career looking at these Western territories. That is the other great federal accomplishment. which is the ability of the United States to acquire territory, establish a governance structure, and use that structure as a transitional phase before those spaces enter the United States as states. So the kind of standard expansion story, that is all premised on the federal government and on federal employees who make that possible. And that came at a cost. That's the point I want to emphasize here. The aggressive growth and successful management of the federal government created extraordinary opportunities and economic possibilities for Euro-Americans, but it was absolutely essential to the extraordinary loss of Native Americans. Native Americans would not have lost their land. They would not have been forcibly removed were it not for the federal government that I study. And every branch is complicit in that. I emphasize all of this because the other thing people often talk about is, had the Constitution not been ratified, it's entirely possible that the Union would have come apart. And I believe that. We usually explain that politically, and rightly so. The Constitution created a structure that enabled the states to interact. It enabled an election of a central leadership where executive authority and legislative authority were counterbalanced in effective ways. All of that is true. It was this political revolution that helped to sustain the Union. But the other part about it is that the federal state helped to sustain the Union as well. And I really, really want to emphasize that. And it's the Constitution that made that possible. The Constitution created the fiscal system that funded that state, and it created an executive branch that would have control over those elements of the federal state. This is the big thing about why it matters. When I started working on this project, a lot of people I knew who studied the political side of the story, how people got elected, how they ran for office, what they did in political parties, would say, yeah, I'm not all that interested in how many people were in the patent office. And at that time, I would argue with them, and I thought it was historically important. I didn't think it would be quite so important as it becomes now. Right now, Americans are having exactly the debate that people had in the founding generation. What is the appropriate scale of government? What should be the president's role in running that government? What happens when government institutions aren't able to satisfy the needs of the public? The government I study did not have many of the institutions we have now. There's no National Institutes of Health in 1800. Those institutions did not exist then, but Americans were having exactly the same debate. That is something I really want people to learn from this. The argument that's happening now is not new. What the federal government does matters. Many of those offices are often out of sight.
We understand that you have 2 more phases for your project, but are you working on other research while you're also working on creating a federal government?
So I'm actually working on 2 projects right now, 2 book projects. One, the working title is How the Founders Governed: Danger and Decision in a Revolutionary Age. And this is going to be about how the founding fathers built and attempted to manage these government agencies. We tend to see them as political figures. We understand their ideas, but these guys ran big organizations. It was really difficult for them. It not only enables us to see their kind of daily challenges, but also I think we can learn a lot by seeing what they did well and didn't do well when they were actually running federal agencies. And they were doing it at a moment of extraordinary risk and extraordinary danger. So that's the book I'm writing now. The other book I'm writing, that's about technology in the American presidency. We often understand the presidency as a product of politics. And my point is there are 3 technologies: communication, transportation, and medicine that really shaped and then redefined the presidency over time. When you look at it that way, it becomes this really interesting story, not just about these technologies, but what did it mean when it took a president a month to get home and then he couldn't communicate with anybody in Washington? What did it mean when a president becoming sick meant that the government shut down for a month? And then also, what does it mean that we now live in a time when the president is omnipresent because he can be connected everywhere, anytime, all at once, you name it. And also, we know every little piece of a president's health and illness.
Peter, if we have more questions about the creating a federal government project, how we can use it, or even questions about the formation of the early American government, where's the best place for us to contact you?
Write to me directly. I've already gotten terrific questions from people about this project. I really, really like getting those questions.
Fantastic. And I will link to your email address in the show notes. Peter Castor, thank you for introducing us to your project, Creating a Federal Government, and for helping us better understand the creation and development of the United States' federal government.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This was a delight.
The founding of the United States didn't end with the ratification of the Constitution or by electing a new president in 1788, 1789. Instead, it required the American people to build a fully functioning federal government. As Peter revealed, the process of building a government was messy, improvisational, and far more expensive than many might assume. The founders of the United States didn't just write about Republican beliefs. They hired revenue collectors, built out maritime hospitals, appointed postmasters, and dispatched consuls to cities and ports across Europe, the Caribbean, and North Africa. They constructed institutions and networks of federal employees who turned ideas about Republican government into everyday governance. What's more, the story of this early federal workforce helps us reimagine where the center of the government actually was. It wasn't New York, Philadelphia, or even Washington, D.C., as many employees served in the nation's peripheries, Western territories, frontier outposts, and distant customs houses. Yet many of these employees helped define what federal authority looked like on the ground. Peter's Creating a Federal Government project makes the stories of these employees accessible and interactive. The project not only helps us understand how the United States governed itself, but it invites us to explore how our own family histories might connect to the early American Republic. Look for more information about Peter, his project, Creating a Federal Government, 1789 to 1829, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/420. Did you enjoy today's episode? Please forward it to a friend. After all, friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Joseph Adelman, Karen Wolf, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, what do you think it took to make the early federal government work? Its founding ideas, the people who carried out those ideas on the ground? I'm curious what you think. So tell me, Liz at benfranklinsworld.com.